Alright, let's get into it. The Soma compound. Picture a military researcher in 1955 sitting in a government office in Maryland, flipping through a pharmaceutical file on a drug that had just been rejected for civilian medical use. The rejection wasn't because it didn't work, it was rejected because it worked too well and in the wrong direction. The compound was carisoprodol, and the side effect that disqualified it from medicine was the same side effect that made the military's eyes light up. It made people calm, compliant, emotionally remote. And in a room full of men trying to figure out how to build a better soldier, that was not a flaw, that was a feature. To understand why the military wanted a drug like this, you have to understand what combat stress was costing the United States Army in the 1950s. The Korean War had just ended, and the psychological casualty rates were staggering. Soldiers were freezing under fire, breaking down in the field, returning home unable to function. The military wasn't looking for a painkiller or a stimulant. They were looking for a way to sand down the emotional edges of a human being without removing his ability to fight. Carisoprodol, developed by chemist Frank Berger, the same man who created meprobamate, the first mass-market tranquilizer in American history, seemed to offer exactly that. Berger's meprobamate, sold under the brand name Milltown, was prescribed to 1 in 20 Americans by 1957, making it the most widely prescribed drug in the country's history at that point. The military was watching. What the Army's internal tests found was more specific than the civilian application suggested. Carisoprodol suppressed the startle reflex, the involuntary flinch response that costs a soldier fractions of a second under fire. It reduced what researchers filed under emotional interference, the hesitation, the grief, the moral calculation that slows a man down when he has to act fast. Field evaluations describe subjects as exhibiting excellent task focus and reduced interpersonal conflict. The language was clean and administrative. What it described was a person who had been chemically relieved of the instincts that make humans hesitate before harming each other. The drug was filed under Performance Stabilization in Declassified Army Chemical Corps documents, a category that did not officially exist in public military pharmacology records. What no one told the test subjects was that carisoprodol metabolizes inside the body into meprobamate, meaning the drug's sedative profile was significantly stronger than its label suggested. Soldiers who believed they were taking a mild muscle relaxant were, in effect, receiving a tranquilizer under a different name. The question of informed consent was not raised in any of the surviving documentation. What was raised eventually was the question of long-term effects. The emotional flattening that researchers had initially celebrated began showing up in follow-up evaluations as something less useful. Men who had been on extended protocols reported an inability to process grief. They described difficulty feeling guilt. They came home and found that the emotional machinery that makes civilian life navigable had been quietly switched off, and no one had told them how to switch it back on. The drug was eventually reclassified as a Schedule of Controlled Substance in 2012, 53 years after FDA approval, following widespread abuse in the general population. The Soma compound sits at number 10 on this list not because it is the least disturbing entry, but because it is the most quietly disturbing. There were no battlefield casualties tied directly to its use, no famous incidents, no Senate hearings. It was simply a drug that was given to men without their full knowledge. That altered something fundamental about who they were, and that was then filed under a bureaucratic category designed to ensure no one ever had to answer for it. They didn't want a faster soldier or a stronger one. They wanted a soldier who had stopped asking questions. And the genuinely unsettling part is that by most of the metrics they were measuring, it worked. The morphine sirets, June 6, 1944. Every American soldier who waded onto the beaches of Normandy that morning carried, pinned inside his uniform, a small metal tube the size of a toothpaste packet. It had a pre-attached needle and a simple twist and press mechanism designed so a man could inject himself through his clothing without removing his gear. It contained 30 milligrams of morphine tartrate. For context, a modern clinical dose for acute post-surgical pain is typically between 2 and 4 milligrams. The men hitting Omaha Beach were carrying enough to kill a civilian. It was standard issue, and it had been standard issue since 1941. The Siret was, by any measure, a genuine miracle of battlefield medicine. Before its widespread adoption, soldiers with severe wounds frequently died not from the wounds themselves, but from traumatic shock, the catastrophic shutdown of the body's systems in response to overwhelming pain. Morphine interrupted that process. It kept men alive long enough to be evacuated, long enough for a surgeon to reach them, long enough for the war to continue without losing a soldier to pain that could have been managed. The United States military manufactured over 500 million syrettes during the Second World War. Field medics were instructed to pin the empty tube to an injured soldier's collar to prevent accidental double dosing. In the chaos of actual combat, that system failed regularly. No one recorded how often. The dose was not a bureaucratic oversight. Military pharmacologists knew before the first syrette was issued that 30 milligrams of morphine tartrate, administered repeatedly under conditions of physical and psychological stress, would produce physical dependency in a significant percentage of recipients. The Army's own internal studies from the 1940s acknowledged dependency as a predictable outcome. They categorized it not as addiction, but as withdrawal casualties, a linguistic sleight of hand that allowed the military to report zero addiction statistics to Congress for nearly 3 decades. Post-war analysis estimated that between 2 and 5% of returning Second World War veterans developed morphine dependency as a direct result of battlefield treatment, representing between 15,000 and 37,000 men. The Korean War produced an estimated 4% dependency rate. By Vietnam, heroin had largely replaced morphine in the field, partly because it was cheaper and more readily available in Southeast Asia, and partly because it was stronger. The Veterans Administration did not classify morphine dependency as a service-connected disability until 1972, 27 years after the war ended. Men who had been rendered dependent on opioids by their own government's medical protocol were denied benefits for nearly 3 decades because the government had already decided, in the language of its own records, that they weren't addicted. They were casualties of a different kind. The deliberate choice to label the condition as withdrawal casualties rather than addiction was not a scientific distinction. It was a financial and legal one, and it held for 27 years before anyone in an official capacity challenged it. The morphine syrettes represent something that will reappear in nearly every entry on this list. The pattern is consistent. A drug works. The military scales it. The human cost of scaling it is noted in internal documents and then buried under administrative language. The men who bear that cost come home and discover that the institutions that sent them there have already decided on paper that the cost does not exist. 500 million syrettes were manufactured and distributed. The question that the surviving records have never cleanly answered is not whether the military knew the dose was addictive. They knew. The question is what exactly they were planning to do about the men who came home. The Führer's Pharmacy, September 1944. Berlin is contracting. Allied forces are closing from the west, Soviet forces from the east, and the man responsible for coordinating the defense of the entire European theater is seated in his private quarters, receiving his daily injection from a physician named Dr. Theodor Morell. That day's injection includes Eucodol, a compound synthesized by German chemists Martin Freund and Edmund Speyer at the University of Frankfurt in 1916, and now recognized by pharmacologists as the direct chemical ancestor of OxyContin. Morell has administered over 800 documented injections to his patient since 1941. His patient is Adolf Hitler, and according to Morell's own captured medical diary, the dosages have been escalating for months. The Nazi state had a pharmaceutical relationship with its military that extended far beyond Hitler's private medical care. From the opening campaigns of the war, the Wehrmacht had operated as a chemically augmented force. Pervitin, a methamphetamine compound manufactured by the Temmler Pharmaceutical Company, had been distributed as standard combat rations since 1939. Senior officers in the Nazi inner circle, however, were on a separate program entirely, one built around opioid management rather than stimulant performance. The distinction matters. Pervitin made soldiers aggressive and awake. Eucodol made its user feel, in the clinical language of the era, a sense of absolute euphoric certainty. It eliminated doubt. It eliminated hesitation. For a man commanding a collapsing military campaign, that pharmacological profile was not incidental, it was catastrophic. Historian Norman Ohler, in his 2015 book Blitzed, cross-referenced Morell's medical diary with Hitler's recorded military decisions across the final years of the war. The correlation Ohler identified was specific and disturbing. The Battle of the Bulge, ordered in December of 1944, was planned during a period Ohler identifies as peak Eucodol dependency, when Hitler was reportedly receiving multiple injections per day and exhibiting the documented clinical symptoms of advanced opioid cycling, which included euphoric certainty followed by violent cognitive collapse. The trembling hands recorded in multiple eyewitness accounts, the inability to sleep, the paranoid refusal to accept field reports contradicting his own assessments, these are not the symptoms of ideology alone. They are the textbook presentation of opioid dependency in its advanced stages. What makes the Nazi pharmacological program uniquely documented is that the German military kept meticulous records of nearly everything. Pervitin distribution ledgers, Morell's injection diary, pharmaceutical supply chain requisitions, almost all of it was ordered destroyed in the final weeks of the war. What survived did so accidentally. In records, the retreating administration didn't reach in time. The Allied investigators who catalogued what remained did so under conditions of deliberate suppression. Dr. Theodore Morell was captured by American forces in 1945. He was never brought to Nuremberg. He was never formally charged with anything. He died quietly in 1948, and the full scope of what he knew about the pharmacological management of the Nazi high command died with him. The question Ohler's research raises is one that mainstream military history has not fully absorbed. If the most consequential military decisions of the 20th century were being made by a man in the grip of an accelerating opioid dependency, then the history of the Second World War is not only a political and ideological history, it is a pharmacological one. The Battle of the Bulge, the refusal to allow retreat at Stalingrad, the catastrophic strategic rigidity of the war's final phase. These decisions have been analyzed through the lens of ideology and megalomania for 80 years. Morell's diary suggests a different lens entirely. The most powerful military force in European history may have been commanded in its final years by a patient. And the most dangerous thing about that is not what it says about Hitler, it is what it says about the men who kept giving him the injections. The truth serum. In 1922, a Texas obstetrician named Robert Ernest House injected a woman in labor with scopolamine, an alkaloid derived from the henbane plant, used for centuries across European folk tradition as a poison, a sedative, and an ingredient in what witch trial prosecutors described as flying ointments. House was using it for its established obstetric application, twilight sleep, a semi-conscious state that reduced the pain and memory of childbirth. What he noticed, and what he published in the Texas State Journal of Medicine that same year, was that his patient answered every question he asked with what appeared to be complete, unfiltered honesty. She had no apparent capacity for evasion. House coined the term truth serum in that paper. 20 years later, the Central Intelligence Agency's predecessor organization called it a starting point. Scopolamine's history as a potential interrogation tool predates the CIA by decades. The OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, began systematic testing under Project Chatter in 1942. Chatter was a classified program specifically designed to identify chemical compounds that could reliably produce what its internal documents called uninhibited disclosure, meaning statements made without the subject's conscious control or deliberate filtering. The pharmacological logic seems sound. Scopolamine at interrogation doses produces complete anticholinergic disruption. Subjects lose the ability to track time, to maintain consistent narrative, to distinguish between what they are choosing to say and what they are simply saying. House's original observation had been replicated in enough clinical settings to make the compound attractive to intelligence planners who were looking for a faster route to information than conventional interrogation provided. The problem, documented in a classified CIA internal report in 1954, was that scopolamine did not produce truth. It produced speech without filtering, which is an entirely different thing. Subjects in Chatter trials did talk. They talked continuously and without apparent inhibition. But they also confabulated, inventing elaborate, detailed, emotionally coherent false memories that felt completely real to them during the session, and sometimes for hours afterward. A subject under scopolamine could describe, with total conviction and vivid detail, events that had never occurred. The 1954 report concluded that intelligence obtained under scopolamine was unreliable and contaminated, and recommended against its continued use as a primary interrogation tool. Scopolamine-based protocols continued under MKUltra until at least 1962. The gap between the 1954 finding and the 1962 continuation is the most revealing detail in the Chatter archive. The CIA knew, by their own assessment, that truth serum produced lies. They continued using it for at least 8 more years. Historians and former intelligence analysts who have reviewed the declassified documents have offered 2 explanations, and both are disturbing in different ways. The first is institutional momentum, the simple fact that programs with funding and personnel tend to continue regardless of their results. The second explanation is more troubling. A drug that makes people talk, even unreliably, gives interrogators something that conventional interrogation does not. It gives them cover. A confession obtained under scopolamine could be presented as voluntary. A subject who had been chemically induced to speak without filtering had, in a purely technical sense, spoken without being physically coerced. The legal and institutional utility of that distinction may have been worth more than accurate intelligence. The modern application of scopolamine is a small adhesive patch used for motion sickness and pre-surgical sedation, administered at approximately 1/200th of the interrogation dose. It is sold over the counter. The Formula House published in 1922 is unchanged. What changed is everything around it: the institutions that decided how it would be used, the legal frameworks that were built to accommodate those decisions, and the filing systems designed to ensure that the gap between what the science showed and what the program did would remain, for as long as possible, a matter of classification rather than accountability. If the CIA knew by 1954 that truth serum produced lies, the question worth sitting with is not whether they used it anyway. They did. The question is what they were actually using it for. Go pills. April 17th, 2002. 2 American F-16 pilots are returning from a combat mission over Afghanistan, running on over 36 consecutive hours without sleep when they spot what appears on their instruments to be a threat on the ground below. They drop. 4 Canadian soldiers die, 8 more are wounded. It is the first Canadian combat death since the Korean War, and it happens not because of enemy fire, not because of equipment failure, not because of bad intelligence, but because the United States Air Force had decided, decades earlier, that sleep was a tactical liability that could be chemically managed. The pilots had been issued dextroamphetamine tablets before their mission. The Air Force called them go pills. The official record called the incident a friendly fire tragedy. What it actually was is a case study. The Go Pill program is the longest continuously running performance drug protocol in American military history. The Air Force began issuing dextroamphetamine, sold commercially as Dexedrine, to combat pilots in the early 1960s, and the program has never been discontinued. It has been rebranded. The standard issue was 10 mg tablets distributed in pairs with instructions not to take both simultaneously. Pilots who flew extended missions, some lasting 12 to 16 hours, were also issued no-go pills, temazepam, a benzodiazepine sedative, to manage their sleep cycles during downtime. The military was not supplementing the human body's natural rhythms. It was replacing them entirely, constructing a chemically managed wake-sleep cycle in which the body's own signals had been subordinated to mission requirements. The Air Force's internal pharmacological studies from 1991, declassified in 2004, found something that the program's architects had either not anticipated or had decided not to prioritize. Dextroamphetamine at operational doses preserved reaction speed and in some cases enhanced it. But it also impaired risk assessment, specifically the cognitive process by which a pilot weighs the probability that a target is what it appears to be before engaging. The internal documents describe this combination as threat miscalibration, a term that captures, in the cleanest possible bureaucratic language, what happened over Tarnack Farm in 2002. Majors Harry Schmidt and William Umbeck were faster, more alert, and more confident than they would have been without the pills. They were also less capable of questioning whether they were right. The drug had removed the hesitation and left the certainty. The 4 men it killed were named Mark Leger, Ainsworth Dyer, Richard Green, and Nathan Smith. Schmidt and Umbeck attempted to use go pill intoxication as a partial defense in the military proceedings that followed. The Air Force rejected the argument and charged them with dereliction of duty. The decision was not purely legal. Accepting the go pill defense would have required the Air Force to formally acknowledge that its own pharmacological program had produced a state of impaired judgment in 2 of its pilots, and that this impaired judgment had directly caused 4 deaths. The institutional cost of that acknowledgement was higher than the institutional cost of charging the pilots. The pilots became the casualty of record. The program was not reviewed. The Air Force replaced dextroamphetamine with modafinil, a wakefulness agent, in subsequent years. The program was not discontinued, it was updated. The Go Pill case is the entry on this list with the most recent, most documented, most publicly verifiable body count. 4 men died with names and ranks and families, killed not by an enemy, but by a pharmacological decision made decades before any of them enlisted. The Air Force's own science had identified the mechanism by which the drug impaired the judgment that would have prevented the deaths. That science was classified, the program continued. Threat miscalibration is a very clean term for a very specific failure. It means the drug made men certain when they should have been cautious. It means the Air Force knew this and issued the drug anyway. And it means that the question of what the Go Pill program has cost, across 60 years of continuous operation is one the declassified record has never been asked to fully answer. The delirium weapon, Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland. 1962. A group of United States Army volunteers have been told they are testing a new antihistamine. Within 90 minutes, they have lost the ability to identify objects placed directly in front of them. Several have forgotten their own names. At least 2 are engaged in detailed conversations with people who are not in the room. One subject, in a report filed that afternoon by a supervising researcher, is described as contented and cooperative, smiling at a fixed point on the wall and responding to questions about what he sees with a level of narrative detail that the researcher notes is remarkable in its coherence. The subject is not on LSD, he is on something the Army considered, in its formal assessments, more operationally useful. The compound designated Agent BZ, 3-quinaclidinyl benzylate by its full chemical name, was developed by the pharmaceutical firm Hoffmann La Roche in 1951 as a potential treatment for gastrointestinal disorders. It was rejected for medical use immediately because of its extreme psychoactive side effects. The United States Army acquired the formula in 1959 and began classified testing at Edgewood Arsenal that same year. Over the next 16 years, approximately 5,000 American military volunteers participated in BZ trials at Edgewood, a number confirmed in the congressional investigations of the 1970s. Volunteers were told varying degrees of the truth about what they were being given. The gap between what they were told and what the compound actually did was, in most documented cases, significant. BZ's mechanism is anticholinergic, meaning it blocks the neurotransmitter acetylcholine throughout the central and peripheral nervous system simultaneously. The result is a state of complete dissociative delirium lasting between 72 and 96 hours, during which the subject cannot form short-term memories, cannot coordinate physical movement reliably, and experiences continuous hallucinations that are perceptually indistinguishable from reality. The military's interest was specific. Unlike LSD, which produces ego dissolution and frequently terror, BZ produced what the Edgewood researchers described as serene confusion. Subjects wandered. They spoke to hallucinated companions. They smiled. They were, in the clinical language of the program, easy to manage. The Army weaponized BZ in 1962 as the M43 cluster bomb, the only incapacitating chemical weapon ever standardized and stockpiled by the United States military. The stated rationale was humanitarian. This was a weapon that would not kill enemy soldiers, it would simply remove them from the battlefield for 3 days. The stockpile was destroyed in 1990 following the Chemical Weapons Convention, and the formula remains fully documented in open scientific literature. What has not been declassified is the behavioral archive that Edgewood researchers maintained across 16 years of human trials. The pharmacology of BZ is understood. What BZ subjects saw during their 72-hour dissociative episodes, who they believed they were speaking to, what narratives their minds constructed in the complete absence of accurate sensory input, that documentation remains outside the public record. Former Edgewood subjects who spoke to journalists after their classification gag orders expired in the early 2000s described experiences that ranged from peaceful to shattering. Several reported that the hallucinations had felt more real than waking life for months afterward. The Army's assessment in the surviving trial records described these outcomes as within acceptable parameters. The question BZ raises is one that the humanitarian framing of the weapon was designed to avoid. A weapon that kills removes a person from the battlefield permanently and visibly. A weapon that induces 3 days of serene compliant delusion removes a person from themselves temporarily and invisibly in a way the person may not even be aware of. The Edgewood subjects who smiled at the wall were not suffering in any way the program's designers would have recognized as harm. They were simply absent from their own experience. When you can engineer a compound that places an enemy soldier in a state of contented unreality for 3 days, never knowing anything has gone wrong, the question worth asking is not whether it is more humane than a bullet. The question is what it means to weaponize consciousness itself, and whether the answer to that question changes depending on whose consciousness it is. The Blitzkrieg Pill, May 1940. French military intelligence is receiving reports from the Ardennes that make no tactical sense. The Ardennes is dense forest, steep terrain, roads too narrow for armored columns. Every assessment produced by the French General Staff has classified it as impassable. And yet, the reports keep coming. German armor is moving through it, moving fast, moving continuously, not stopping to sleep, not stopping to eat. covering distances in 24-hour windows that military planners, using every available model of human endurance, have calculated are physically impossible for unmedicated troops. What French intelligence does not know, what Allied command will not fully understand until after the war, is that the soldiers crossing the Ardennes have been issued 35 million methamphetamine tablets by the Wehrmacht High Command. The drug's name is Pervitin. The offensive it enables will fall France in 6 weeks. Pervitin was not a secret within Germany. Manufactured by the Temmler Pharmaceutical Company in Berlin beginning in 1937, it was available over the counter by 1938. Marketed as an alertness aid and distributed in chocolate form under the names Flieger Schokolade, Pilot's Chocolate, and Panzer Schokolade, Tanker's Chocolate. German housewives sent it in care packages. It was reviewed favorably in women's magazines as a diet aid and mood enhancer. The militarization of Pervitin was, in this context, less a covert program than a natural institutional extension of a drug the entire culture had already normalized. Dr. Otto Ranke, director of the Institute for General and Defense Physiology, oversaw the Wehrmacht distribution program and wrote in his 1940 field report, following the Ardennes advance, that troops were fresh and cheerful, discipline excellent, and that Pervitin was doing its job. He was describing men who had been awake for 60 to 72 continuous hours and were still advancing. The daily dose issued to Wehrmacht soldiers was 20 milligrams, approximately twice the maximum therapeutic dose of modern prescription Adderall. At that level, methamphetamine does not simply suppress sleep, it suppresses the neurological systems that register exhaustion, hunger, and physical pain. It elevates aggression and suppresses empathy. It produces a state that military planners found extraordinarily useful and that the soldiers experiencing it often described as invincibility. What it did not suppress, and what became apparent within 18 months of widespread use, was the crash. Wehrmacht Medical Corps began filing reports in 1941 of cardiac arrest in soldiers under 30, psychotic breaks in the field, and severe physical dependency requiring hospitalization. In response, the Nazi government reclassified Pervitin under the Reich Opium Law in 1941, making it a controlled substance within Germany's civilian population. Distribution to soldiers on the Eastern Front increased. The Allied forces defending against the Ardennes advance reported something in the German soldiers they encountered that they could not categorize as normal combat behavior. Captured soldiers who had been marching for days without apparent rest showed no signs of the fatigue that should have been incapacitating them. Field medics noted pupils fixed in full dilation, elevated heart rates, a complete absence of the involuntary behavioral markers of exhaustion. Allied commanders interpreted this as fanaticism, ideological conditioning, so complete that normal human limitations had been suspended by belief. It was chemistry. The distinction matters because fanaticism is a psychological and cultural phenomenon. What Pervitin did was pharmacological and reproducible, and the Wehrmacht's own medical records confirm that the performance enhancement was real, measurable, and consistent across the entire cohort that received it. The fall of France in the summer of 1940 is one of the most analyzed military events of the 20th century. Historians have attributed it to failures of Allied command structure, to the Maginot Line's strategic rigidity, to the boldness of German operational planning. Norman Ohler's archival research adds a variable that traditional military history has been slow to incorporate. The most successful armored offensive in modern European history was fueled, in a direct and documented sense, by 35 million doses of methamphetamine. When the drug finally wore off, the men who had taken it were left with cardiovascular damage, psychological instability, and a physical dependency that the Reich Opium Law's reclassification did nothing to treat. The Blitzkrieg was not just a tactical innovation, it was a pharmacological one. And when the pharmacology ended, it ended badly, in a way no military manual produced before or since has ever fully figured out how to address: the mind war. November 19th, 1953. A biochemist named Frank Olson falls from the window of a New York hotel room on the 10th floor. He has been employed by the United States Army at Fort Detrick, Maryland, working on classified biological and chemical research. 9 days before his death, he was given a glass of Cointreau at a work retreat in rural Maryland. The Cointreau had been spiked with lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, by his CIA supervisor without his knowledge. The CIA classified the incident. His family was told it was a suicide. 22 years later, when the files were partially opened, his son Eric Olson began a decades-long effort to establish what actually happened. In 1994, he had his father's body exhumed. Forensic anthropologist James Starrs found a hematoma above the left eye inconsistent with a fall and consistent with a blow delivered before Olson went through the window. MKUltra was formally authorized by CIA Director Allen Dulles on April 13, 1953, 6 months before Frank Olson died. It ran as an active program until 1973, when Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all program files 2 days before a congressional investigation was scheduled to begin. The program operated across 80 institutions in the United States and Canada, including 44 universities, 15 research foundations, and 12 hospitals. Most of those institutions did not know they were receiving CIA funding. Most of the individuals who participated as research subjects did not know they were in a program. The Church Committee hearings in 1977 established the program's broad contours. What they established was that MKUltra had administered LSD, along with mescaline, barbiturates, and scopolamine to mental patients, prisoners, sex workers, and foreign nationals, none of whom had given consent. The goal of the LSD component was not therapy and not recreation. The program's architects wanted to know whether LSD could be used to extract confessions, implant false memories, and produce what internal documents described as programmable behavioral responses in enemy agents. The most extreme application of this logic was funded at McGill University in Montreal, where psychiatrist Dr. Ewan Cameron was conducting experiments he called psychic driving. Cameron placed subjects, most of them psychiatric patients admitted for conditions ranging from depression to anxiety, into drug-induced comas lasting weeks. During these comas, they were subjected to looping recorded messages designed to disrupt existing behavioral patterns and to electroshock treatments, calibrated to what Cameron described as depatterning, the systematic erasure of an existing personality. In multiple documented cases, subjects emerged from Cameron's protocols without names, without memories, without languages, and without control of basic bodily functions. The CIA's internal assessment of Cameron's work described depatterning as promising but inconsistent. The reason MKUltra's files were not entirely destroyed in 1973 is that a separate collection of program financial records had been stored in a different building, a records vault the destruction order did not reach. Those files, discovered during a 1977 archival review, are the primary source for everything the public currently knows about the program. What they represent is the fraction of the documentation that was too boring to destroy, procurement records and budget approvals rather than experimental protocols and subject files. The full scope of the program, its complete list of subjects, its complete findings, remains unknown. The surviving fragments are enough to establish that the program existed, that it operated for 20 years inside American institutions, and that it used American citizens as research material without their knowledge or consent. Frank Olson's case remains officially unresolved. The most classified finding of MKUltra was not that LSD could break a human mind. It is that with sufficient institutional support, sufficient legal architecture, and sufficient organizational willingness to look away, you could break a mind and classify the process as science. You could do it in a university hospital, you could do it to a psychiatric patient who came in with depression, you could fund it through a research foundation that had no idea who was actually paying its grants. And the only reason the public knows any of it happened is because someone in 1973 forgot to burn a box. Everything else, everything the program found, everything it did, everything it concluded about the limits of a human mind went into the fire. What we have is the receipt. The science is gone. The last experiment. Late 1944. The Allied armies are closing from the west. The Soviet forces are closing from the east. Germany's pharmaceutical supply chains are fracturing, and in a laboratory at the University of Kiel, a researcher named Dr. Gerhard Orzechowski is finalizing the formula for a compound commissioned by the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, for use by human torpedo pilots and submarine crews on extended missions. The compound is called D9. It contains 3 active ingredients in a single oral tablet: 5 milligrams of cocaine hydrochloride, 3 milligrams of Pervitin, which is methamphetamine, and 5 milligrams of Eucadal, which is oxycodone. 3 of the most powerful stimulant and analgesic compounds available at the time, combined in a single dose, specifically calibrated to allow a human being to march continuously for 90 kilometers without rest. The testing is conducted at Sachsenhausen concentration camp. The subjects are inmates. They are not volunteers. The logic of D9 was not irrational from a purely engineering standpoint. Each of its 3 components addressed a specific biological limitation. Cocaine suppressed appetite and acute fatigue. Pervitin maintained aggression and sustained wakefulness. Eucadal, the oxycodone compound, eliminated physical pain. Together, the three drugs did not enhance the body's capabilities. They disconnected the body's distress signaling system entirely. Pain signals that would normally cause a person to stop, hunger signals that would normally cause a person to slow, fatigue signals that would normally cause a person to sleep, all of them were chemically overridden simultaneously. The Kriegsmarine wanted pilots for the Nager and Biber human torpedo programs, single-operator submersible vessels, with casualty rates high enough that pilot endurance was genuinely the limiting operational factor. D9 was the solution to a logistics problem. The field trials at Sachsenhausen produced results that the Wehrmacht's pharmacologists recorded with clinical precision. Subjects carrying weighted military packs marched in circles under observation. The documented endurance figures ranged between 70 and 90 kilometers before collapse, approximately double the measured endurance of unmedicated subjects under comparable conditions. The researchers noted that subjects showed no behavioral signs of fatigue during the active phase of the drug's effect. The collapse, when it came, was total and sudden, a physiological shutdown that the supervising physicians described in the field trial records as consistent with complete systemic exhaustion. There was no gradual slowing, there was function, and then there was the floor. Allied investigators found the Sachsenhausen trial documentation in 1945. They classified their findings. The complete report was not declassified until 1999. The 54-year gap between discovery and declassification has never been fully explained. The Allied investigators who found the D9 documentation in 1945 were working in the same operational environment as the teams cataloging Nazi pharmaceutical research on Pervitin and Eucadal, the same environment that would, within a decade, produce Operation Paperclip, the American program that brought over 1,600 German scientists and engineers into United States government employment. Whether any of the D9 research survived into post-war Allied pharmacological programs is a question the declassified record does not answer. The timing of the 1999 declassification, which coincides with the re-release of several additional MK-Ultra documents, suggests the two bodies of research were housed in the same archival category, classified under the same general framework for the same general reasons. D9 did not fail because it did not work. The field trial data shows clearly that it worked. It failed because the war ended before the Kriegsmarine could deploy it at scale, and because Germany's pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity had collapsed too completely to produce it in the quantities the Navy required. That distinction between a program terminated because its results were unacceptable and a program terminated because its supply chain ran out is the most honest thing the surviving record has to say about the limits of what military pharmacology was willing to attempt. The compound was designed in a university laboratory, tested on concentration camp prisoners, and abandoned for logistical rather than ethical reasons. The researchers who designed it were not outliers. They were employees doing commissioned work, and the institution that commissioned it considered the testing protocol a reasonable scientific method, the architecture of obedience. 1977. A man named Sidney Gottlieb sits before the United States Senate and describes, under oath and in calm, measured language, a program he ran for the Central Intelligence Agency for over 20 years. The program was designed, in his own words, to determine whether a human mind could be pharmacologically reduced to a state of total behavioral compliance, a state in which a subject would perform acts against his own will and against his own fundamental interests, with no conscious memory of having done so. Gottlieb expresses no particular regret. He notes that the program has been terminated. He does not mention that the termination order came with a 2-day head start to destroy the files. He does not mention Project Artichoke, the program that preceded MK-Ultra and that, in the surviving documentation, asked an even more specific question than the one he has described to the Senate. He retires on a full CIA pension, he moves to a farm in Virginia, he dies in 1999. His New York Times obituary describes him as a man of contradictions. Project Artichoke ran from 1951 to 1953, immediately preceding MK-Ultra, and was specifically designed around a single operational question. The question appears verbatim in a 1952 internal memo, declassified in 2001. Can we get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will and against his fundamental interests? This is not a paraphrase. It is the program's stated goal, written in standard bureaucratic memorandum format, filed alongside procurement requests and personnel reviews, in the same institutional language used to order office supplies. Artichoke's pharmacological toolkit included scopolamine, mescaline, heroin, barbiturates, and a compound referred to only as TD in the surviving documents. The full identity of TD has never been confirmed in any declassified source. The same memo that poses the program's central question also includes a passage addressing what it describes as the disposal question, meaning what to do with subjects who know too much. The proposed solutions include long-term institutionalization. One passage uses the phrase termination with extreme prejudice. It is written in the same tone as the rest of the document. Dr. Ewan Cameron's work at McGill University, funded through MKUltra, achieved through extended drug-induced coma and electroshock what artichokes' pharmacological protocols alone could not produce consistently. In at least 3 documented cases, subjects who underwent Cameron's full depatterning protocol emerged with functional behavioral responses to specific verbal triggers, responses that Cameron's notes describe as implanted rather than naturally developed. The Canadian government paid 100,000 Canadian dollars in out-of-court settlements to Cameron's surviving victims in 1992. The United States government has never acknowledged liability for Cameron's CIA-funded work. The settlement terms required the Canadian recipients to accept no admission of wrongdoing from either government as a condition of payment. Cameron died in 1967, before the program's existence was publicly established. His institutional reputation remained intact until the Church Committee hearings a decade later. The Stargate program, which ran from 1978 to 1995 and explored parapsychological intelligence applications including remote viewing, used a pharmacological priming protocol in its early trials. Subjects received undisclosed compounds before sessions, described in early program documents as intended to lower cognitive resistance. The protocol was quietly abandoned in 1983. The compounds were never identified in the available declassified record. The connection between Stargate's pharmacological priming and the compounds developed under MKUltra and Artichoke has not been formally established in any public document. The proximity of the programs, in timeline, in institutional sponsorship, and in stated goal is a matter of record. What it represents is left, in the surviving archive, as an open question. Every program on this list was built around a version of the same institutional calculation. The human body is a performance system with identifiable limitations. Those limitations can be pharmacologically addressed. The question of what is lost in the addressing is a secondary consideration to be handled administratively. Sidney Gottlieb testified before the Senate and described a 20-year program designed to erase human will and then retired to a farm in Virginia. The men who designed D9 tested their compound on concentration camp prisoners and filed the results as scientific data. The Air Force issued dextroamphetamine to combat pilots, identified the mechanism by which it impaired judgment, classified the finding, and continued the program. The pattern across every entry on this list is not aberration. It is not the behavior of rogue scientists or isolated programs. It is institutional logic applied consistently across decades, across governments, across wars, to the same fundamental question. How far can you push a human being before they stop being human? The programs on this list represent the documented attempts to find out. What makes the question worth sitting with is not that institutions asked it. It is that no formal record exists of any institution in any of these programs receiving an answer they considered sufficient reason to stop asking. These 10 entries are not a collection of historical curiosities. They are data points in a single continuous project, one that began with a muscle relaxant filed under performance stabilization and ended, at least in the documents we can read, with a Senate testimony delivered without regret. The soldiers who took morphine syrettes on Normandy Beach, the pilots who took go pills over Afghanistan, the psychiatric patients in Cameron's depatterning program, and the concentration camp inmates who marched in circles at Sachsenhausen wearing weighted packs, they are all part of the same inquiry. The inquiry was never about medicine. It was about the boundary between a person and a tool. And the most significant thing the historical record shows is not how close any of these programs came to crossing that boundary. It is how completely, in some cases, they crossed it, and how little of the documentation survived. If this is the history we can read, the question worth asking is what the history we cannot read contains. Go to the comments and tell us which entry changed how you think about military science. And if you want more of the history that was never supposed to survive, subscribe. This archive is just getting started. The programs on this list were not accidents, they were policies. The drugs were not mistakes, they were decisions. Subscribe, because the next chapter of this story is already waiting.